This is episode 2 of Akendi Talks, deep dives into the people, processes, and ideas shaping UX today. Today's conversation is about the tension between UX processes, the deeper body of knowledge behind them, and how focusing too much on following steps rather than understanding why they exist can lead to poor business and design outcomes.
Of course, UX has lots of different processes, could argue some fundamental ones. It's also a vast body of knowledge. We're going to be talking about how being overly fixated on the process can have some pretty significant business outcomes that you're not looking for. And we're going to talk about how to avoid them and how to do better in the real world. Maybe we'll start with just what's the difference between the process and body of knowledge of UX?
So in UX, you see often a love for process. We have lots of them, I would say. Any field has that, but we are definitely good at coming up with a new term, with a new set of things, and then we call the process. We think we have a better way to do it. So every couple of years, there's a version of it, whether it's called user-centered design 30, 40 years ago, human-centered design, then design thinking, lean UX, agile UX, jobs to be done, the double diamonds. Am I missing any? There's more processes?
Oh, that's a lot of processes already. Yes, we have lots of processes. So is that inherently bad?
Well, I think processes in most cases are best practices pulled together into a coherent set of steps. And so in general, I would say processes are good because they take best practices into a version that people can apply quickly. And even though that sounds great, it also creates a danger of not thinking much about why I do these steps. And as long as I follow the cookbook rules and the lists of things that I need to do, I'm going to be fine. That's where things get, I think, off the rails, because we're not thinking anymore why we're doing it. We're not thinking anymore why these steps make sense in this order and why they are created in the first place.
And I think that's the key difference between what we're calling the process and the body of knowledge. The body of knowledge, you had to learn the why. And in theory, if you'd never heard of any of these processes before, but you understood about human behavior and how systems work involving technology and all these other things that are kind of fundamental, you could come up with these processes. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean, it was more a cyclic sort of thing where people would try some processes, go back and go, well, we don't really understand the body of knowledge. And then they'd do something else and evolve the processes and so forth. We've gotten so in love with them that you could learn all this in 2 weeks, because you can kind of learn a process in 2 weeks without the why or a brief discussion of the why. So here's what you do first. Here's what you do second. Here's what you do third. And so you can take smart people, teach them all that in 2 weeks. But then when you throw them back into reality, if all the assumptions, and assumptions are hidden in the whys, all the assumptions behind that process you taught them and the templates you created, they're not all valid, you can be in real trouble.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what you see often in the use of these templates. For example, creating personas, creating a journey map, or even wireframes. Or if you say templates and you strike that out, then you say technique, or a way of doing things, like doing a card sort or doing some strategic visioning workshop, a co-design workshop. There are all these techniques and all these templates that are used and then stuffed into some order. Well, we need to do first this workshop, then that thing. Every project becomes the same format, having the same length sometimes even, regardless of the problem that we try to solve. You see that very much in one of those other techniques that has came up more recently, which are design sprints, where these teams try to follow a process and say, well, design sprints were described first in its meaningful way by Google. They say, let's take 5 days and tackle a meaty problem in 5 days. And in that 5 days, you do pretty much a small version of the process, where you start to discover, you start to understand, you start to prototype, you start to test. You do all the steps that you typically do in the process, but done in 5 days. Obviously, not every problem fits in those 5 days.
Yeah.
And not everything can be handled by the 5 days. But you see team holding on to that process to say, this is the answer.
Yeah, I'm trying to redesign the healthcare system. Well, you got 5 days.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I've seen companies that disregard scope and scale in their process, which is what that is. You're building an app that has 3 tasks for one person, or you're building an app that's going to manage an airport. Both cases, we've got the exact same thing. It's going to take me this many weeks, and we're going to do this, and we'll deliver this. And boxing it by design, right? But not boxing it by understanding. If you got someone who's got 3 tasks to do on a little app, you can understand a ton in 6 weeks, maybe more than you need. But if you're trying to understand how an airport works, forget it. So what happens is you just gather as much as you can get, and then you got to box your design somehow anyways. You're just, we're going to do a high-level information architecture and some example things, and we're going to throw it over to the engineers because it's an airport, right? Whereas for the other one, you can finish the design. In those 2 cases, you had a completely different role. One, you're really the researcher and designer. And then in the second one, I don't know what you'd call that.
Yeah, but you have checked the box. You've done it. And you can say, you've done the steps, you've done the process. And sometimes that feels like it becomes a goal in of itself. That's too bad, because I think that a lot of processes are meant to do the right things. And like I said before, they are about best practices, but they also try to drive the outcome. And so what's really important here is, what is the outcome? What do you try to achieve? The goal is never to do personas or to do wireframes. The goal is to create a good design or to create a good experience. That's the goal, and that's what you try to impact.
Yeah. And to your point, the goal of the research is some sort of understanding and insight, right? I need to gather enough understanding and insight about the users and their context and environment, all that stuff. Why would you think that would take the same amount of time for a tiny little app versus multiple users, right? Yeah, and that's saying I hadn't thought of it before, but it'd be interesting if box you ticked was, instead of a process box, an understanding box in research, for instance. If I understand why you're doing it, I don't really care that you followed contextual interviews or what. It's like, so you got this deep understanding and insights, and that's going to help my business. Okay.
And that's what you should be doing. So the order should be reversed. It not starts with the technique, not starts with the template, not starts with the process step, but starts with what I want to know, which everybody knows of it. What are we trying to achieve? What's the goal? What are the whys? And then when you read any articles, everybody says that, but we're not doing it. The first question I hear is, we need to do co-design. And then nobody asks the question, why should we do co-design at this point? Is that actually getting us there? What is the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, we see that a lot. I'll get you going with this one. I know in RFPs, right? That we get an RFP that's not asking about that, but says something very explicit. There are these 3 phases, and the first phase we're going to do co-design, and you have to dig to see if there even is a why behind that, or if it's just kind of a mimicry, right? They took some courses or saw something that was successful. Maybe you do start with co-design, but they saw something work and now they're copying it. Right?
Absolutely. But I think the RFP conversation, I think, is another podcast, but having a prescribed way and steps following that. And the challenge is that you need to be able to adapt, because when you look at what the outcome is used for, a lot of times your stakeholders and your internal clients or external clients, they don't really care how you do it, as long as you get the outcome that they're looking for. And so they will find, of course, ways to shorten it, to do it cheaper, or to do it differently. And then you argue for, well, we really need to do this technique and the other. But I find that some UXers have difficulty explaining the value of certain technique because they actually never thought of that themselves. They say, well, no, of course you need to do strategy stuff. Of course you need to do testing for usability. And then they talk about what the benefit of the technique is, but not in the context of the overall goal.
I've also seen it where it's so obvious or so internalized, or they've seen it been successful so many times, they almost can't fathom why someone doesn't want to follow the process. And we do, as a community, love the process and coming up with new ones and improving it and sharing techniques around the process and things like that. It's not anti-process, right? All these things that have happened have been super powerful. We should do usability testing and insert that into the process of, because it makes a huge, huge difference. Or we should observe people on site in their work. It's super powerful, but for clients, it's more the outcome. and less the process.
Yeah, and that's what we should be focusing on. And so I think instead of more mechanically stick to our guns to say we need to do this step, we need to do that step, because it's important, we have to carefully listen. What is the issue? What are the things we're trying to solve? Do we need to do as much research as we think we need to do? Because sometimes the problem statement is not so much needing more research, but sometimes it might be more testing. And say, let's do more iterations of the design because we need to figure this out. So you may lean more into a design test cycle as opposed to a research design cycle or a research design and test cycle. And that flexibility I see sometimes lacking. That conversation around what's really the good mix of things we should be doing, and not just mechanically do the steps, but go, no, with this problem at hand, we think we can get away more with doing less strategy and a bit more research and more design and less testing. Any combination of that. What's the profile of the challenge that we're dealing with? That's the conversation we should be having.
Well, and to your point, we sometimes get into projects. And of course, we don't know. We take our best guess, like you should do this much research up front, and then we're going to do a round of usability testing with so many people. And then you discover that you've got some hidden usability problem or something. It's like, well, we need to fix it and test it again. Even though we said we'd do one set of testing, if we want that outcome, it's demanding a second. I had a friend, he probably doesn't mind me mentioning him, Paul Boyd. We both worked at the same company. He was asked basically to do way too much research up front for this company. And he said, by the time I got to the nth person, he's going, I know literally what you're going to say and do at this moment. And then it's wasting money. He'd already gotten all the insights he was going to get. And the insight line was attenuating to mathematics of knowledge, right? And no returns for all that extra information.
I think so too. And I think that balance needs to be struck. As you get more experience in doing that, I think you can lean more into that body of knowledge approach, where you say, I got my toolbox here. I can pick all the tools I need, but I know how much, I know when, I know in what order, but I am flexible. I can change it up. I can make it. Yes, the process is one answer to it. And it got me going at first, and I understand it at first. Now I'm at a level and I have understanding that I can go mix it up. Go, let's really dig into the problem statement and get the right answer to that problem.
Yep. We've talked a little bit about it off and on through this whole conversation, but if you're going to step back, why is this an issue today? What are the 2 or 3 things that, because we're so process oriented rather than body of knowledge oriented, what are the 2 or 3 big problems that's creating for business/UX?
The main point is that we're still in a situation where we have to explain and advocate and create awareness of the process itself to our clients and to our counterparts. If they're truly managing on impact and on results and on outcomes, then it's easy. Then you can really do this flexible mix of things that you need to do to get to the outcome. The reality is oftentimes our clients and our stakeholders are watching over our shoulders how we do things and what we do. And they ask along the way a lot of questions of, why is this good? Why do you need to do this now? Can we do it shorter? So that awareness piece, we're looked at constantly. We're talking as if we're on a stage all the time. Yeah. And I think that creates a bit of a feeling that we need to justify all these things. And so it's safer to point to a process. It's safer to say, we're following this industry established thing that is less questioned and that's less challenged. Because otherwise it sounds like I don't know what I'm doing. That loosey-goosey feeling that the client may get, we try to avoid that. So we don't hide behind it, but we do use it as a crutch to say, we need to give you some stability because at least you won't question me as much.
That's interesting. I'm getting a picture in my head as we're having this conversation of foundational knowledge or body of knowledge leads to best practices, leads to fixed process. But if things get more complex, you got to keep backing up, right? And you can back up from process to best practices because they're a little more flexible. But then if you're stuck on that, you've got to back up to body of knowledge. And then the other thing you've got to do sometimes is go, it's not just my body of knowledge. We've got to actually bring in the business person, the technical person, and what are your foundational bodies of knowledge? Because we have a complex problem here. Just the technical guys can't do this. The business guys have this problem. We found this UX impact. We're not going to solve it by ourselves. We need to bring all that deep knowledge. And if we're the ones without that deep knowledge, we just run our process, then we're going to let everyone down.
And that's the same what we expect of other areas too. We have to be flexible. They have to be flexible. We're all looking at the same, we're on the same page, looking in the same direction, all those things. It is flexibility that ultimately gets us there because we can't always predict how this will unfold. And we have to be ready for that.
That's probably, to me, maybe the major thing it gives you is flexibility, adaptability, whatever you want to call it. If you really understand what's going on, you can't be cornered in the same way. Just understanding when it's something we don't know yet or we haven't come across, or right. Whereas if you're back up at that process level and going, oh, we just have to do this thing, you're just going to do the thing, it's not going to work.
That wraps up this week's episode of Akendi Talks. UX processes are useful, but they're not the point. Real value comes from understanding the why, staying flexible, and focusing on outcomes, not just following steps. If this episode raised questions, sparked debate, or made you rethink how you're using process in your own work, we'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation on Akendi's social channels or visit www.akendi.ca to learn more about how we help teams get beyond process and design for impact in the real world.